Late April 1945. The heart of Europe trembles under relentless bombardment, while the Third Reich collapses around its capital. In the ruined streets of Berlin, smoke veils the sky. Artillery thunder shakes shattered buildings. Civilians huddle in basements as the Red Army draws closer every hour. In this desperate twilight of war, one name would echo in Hitler's bunker with improbable hope: General Walther Wenck. Could this young commander, barely in his mid-40s, lead a relief army to save the besieged city? Or was it already too late? History remembers the fall of Berlin as inevitable, yet the story of Wenck's last attempt remains a dramatic episode, an intersection of duty, humanity, and the tragic futility of war. His decisions in those final days would define the fate of thousands, not only soldiers but also civilians trapped in the dying capital. If you enjoy exploring such true and compelling moments from the past, consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. There are many more captivating stories of history ahead. Walther Wenck was not the archetypal figure of the old Prussian officer corps. Born in 1900 in Wittenberg, he was part of a generation too young for command in the First World War, but fully shaped by the Reichswehr of the 1920s and 1930s. Intelligent, pragmatic, and technically skilled, Wenck gained a reputation for organizational acumen and an ability to motivate troops even in adversity. By 1942 to 1943, he held staff positions under Heinz Guderian, contributing to the armored doctrine of the Wehrmacht. By April 1945, he had risen to command the 12th Army, one of the last relatively coherent German forces west of Berlin. The strategic situation of the Reich was catastrophic. Allied armies advanced from the west, already across the Rhine, while Soviet forces under Marshals Zhukov and Konev surrounded Berlin with overwhelming manpower and firepower. Hitler, in his Führerbunker beneath the Reich Chancellery, continued issuing orders disconnected from reality. One such order was to Wenck: march east, break through the Soviet lines, and relieve Berlin. The idea sounded heroic, but conditions on the ground made it nearly impossible. Wenck's army consisted largely of young conscripts, training battalions, and remnants of battered divisions. Supply lines were collapsing, fuel and ammunition were scarce. Yet Wenck, a professional soldier, sought to follow his orders while balancing the ethical responsibility of minimizing needless loss of life. This tension would define his actions in the days ahead. On April 22, 1945, Hitler demanded Wenck strike east toward Berlin. The plan envisioned the 12th Army linking with General Theodor Buss's 9th Army, encircled near the Spreewald, and then pushing on to the capital. In theory, this could relieve pressure on Berlin's defenders. In reality, Soviet forces fielded hundreds of thousands of troops, backed by massive artillery and air power. Wenck's forces were far fewer, many barely trained teenagers or older Volkssturm. Nonetheless, Wenck began his advance on April the 24th. His troops achieved some local successes against surprised Soviet units near Balitz and Treuenbrietzen. For a brief moment, it appeared that a corridor toward Berlin might be forced open. Soldiers and officers spoke of rescuing trapped civilians. The morale, despite exhaustion, was lifted by the clarity of their mission. But each kilometer was paid with mounting casualties. Soviet resistance stiffened. Fresh units were thrown against Wenck's spearheads. Moreover, the 9th Army was unable to break out toward Wenck as planned. They were trapped in the Elbe pocket, suffering tremendous losses. Wank received grim reports. Berlin was fully encircled. Soviet forces controlled the approaches. Communications with the city were sporadic at best. Time was running out, and his army risked being cut off entirely if it pressed further. By April the 26th to 27th, Wank confronted the harsh truth. Reaching Berlin was militarily impossible. His units were overstretched, supplies nearly exhausted. Soviet armor and artillery outmatched his formations. In those days, thousands of civilians, along with wounded soldiers and retreating Wehrmacht units, streamed westward. They sought to avoid Soviet captivity, fearing reprisals and the harsh conditions of Eastern internment. Wank made a critical decision. Instead of a doomed drive on Berlin, he redirected his efforts to open corridors for refugees and retreating troops toward the Elbe River, where U.S. forces had halted their advance under prior Allied agreements. This shift of focus from an impossible offensive to a humanitarian rescue was not ordered from above. It was Wank's own interpretation of his duty. His 12th Army fought delaying actions against Soviet forces while simultaneously organizing safe passages for civilians. Contemporary accounts describe long columns of refugees crossing bridges under fire, aided by Wank's soldiers who maintained order despite chaos. Reports estimate that his actions allowed up to 250,000 people, soldiers and civilians alike, to reach American lines instead of falling into Soviet hands. Meanwhile, in Berlin, the situation deteriorated irreversibly. Hitler would commit suicide on April 30th. The city surrendered on May 2nd. Wank's forces, having avoided total destruction, eventually surrendered to U.S. forces in early May near Tangermünde. The so-called Relief of Berlin had transformed into a different kind of salvation, one measured not in military victory, but in human lives saved. After the war, Wank was held as a prisoner by the Allies, but was released in 1947. Unlike many high-ranking officers, he was not implicated in war crimes. He lived quietly, later working as an industrial executive in West Germany. His reputation as the boy general who tried to save Berlin carried a complex legacy. Some contemporaries viewed him as loyal to a doomed regime. Others emphasized his last-minute humanitarian actions as a rare light in a dark time. Historians have debated Wank's motives and the broader significance of his actions. Could Wank have reached Berlin if he had pressed harder? Most scholars agree the answer is no. The Soviet ring was simply too strong, and his army too weak. The episode, however, highlights the chaotic final days of the Third Reich and the tragic consequences of orders divorced from reality. Wank's pivot to rescue operations demonstrated pragmatic leadership amid collapse, contrasting with the rigid fanaticism of some Nazi officials. The Elbe pocket, where remnants of the Ninth Army fought desperately to escape, underscores the same tragedy. Wank's efforts likely saved some survivors of that encirclement as they fled west. His decisions, though militarily insignificant for the war's outcome, had profound personal consequences for those who lived because of them. The last days of April 1945 were a storm of destruction and despair. Wank's march could not alter the outcome of the war. Berlin's fall was inevitable given the overwhelming forces arrayed against it. Yet within that inevitability lies a narrative worth remembering, not for the battles fought, but for the lives spared. History often focuses on grand victories or defeats, but sometimes its most meaningful moments are those of quiet defiance against senseless destruction. Post-war Germany has grappled with how to remember figures like Wank. His story invites nuanced reflection. He served a criminal regime, yet acted with an apparent sense of responsibility when it mattered most. Leadership, as his case shows, is not only measured by achieving strategic objectives, but also by the courage to make humane choices when all else is lost. Even decades later, accounts from civilians who crossed to safety under his army's protection speak of gratitude toward an officer they had never met personally, highlighting how small acts of pragmatism can ripple through history. What lessons can we draw today? Perhaps that even in the darkest times, individuals can choose compassion over blind obedience. The story of Walther Wenck reminds us of the cost of war and the weight of command decisions on human lives. Remembering such episodes underscores the importance of preventing future conflicts and valuing humanity above ideology. If you enjoyed this exploration of history, please like the video, subscribe, and enable notifications so you won't miss future stories from the past.